This week on Israel Update.
From the time that the construction of this Israeli security fence started, the number of attacks declined by more than 90%. The number of Israelis murdered and wounded decreased by more than 70% and then 85% respectively following the building of this fence.
Israel Update is brought to you by the generous supporters of the Israel Partnership. Because of their love for Israel, we are able to bring you this show and continue to sow into the nation of Israel and the Jewish people. For more information on how to become a sustaining partner, please click the Israel Partner banner below.
Hi again, and thank you so much for joining us. This is the Israel Update channel on the House of Destiny Network, and I'm very pleased to again be continuing last week's discussion with my mother, Fiona Desfontaine, and I'm very happy that she's here. So, Mom, thank you for being here.
Thank you for inviting me.
And so last week what we did is we started looking at how Israel is not an apartheid state, and we really kind of laid a little bit of a foundation about South Africa, because South Africa is where apartheid came from. You know, that's where the term came from. And so what we were doing is looking at what South Africa was. My mom was speaking about that, how she was there, seeing it all take place. And then we kind of looked at how the South African apartheid regime is paralleled so closely to the Nazi regime under Hitler, and how if anybody should have compassion on the Jewish people, it's South Africans that were oppressed under the apartheid regime. And so it really is lunacy that they're so often the people that are kind of shouting about free Palestine this, free Palestine that, when they actually have no idea what's going on, and that the Jews are the furthest thing from people that are propagating apartheid, and Israel is not an apartheid state. So, Mom, I know there's something else you wanted to speak about regarding South Africa.
Carrying on with this.
Carrying on
about the
we jumped straight in and just carried on doing part two, because we realized we were never going to finish in one show. So you carry straight on.
So I just want to go back to something that I said in the last show, and that was this immorality law, that in which a policeman could just break into somebody's house and find a black person and a white person in bed together, and they could be hauled before the law courts under the immorality law. And it's very similar to what used to happen in Nazi Germany when there was the persecution of the Jews before the war actually broke out, where they would be able to just break into people's homes and go, "You're a Jew," and take them away. And so again, this parallel is something that we're going to be seeing, and I'm really praying and trusting that our eyes will be opened to have an objective, God's eye view of everything that's going on. Because there's South Africa, and I'm going to be going back into that in a moment, but there's also Germany. Because what goes on in Israel is that people compare it to apartheid South Africa, which, well, I'll tell you a bit about that in a moment, but they also compare the wall of protection in Israel to the Berlin Wall. Yeah. And yet again, Germany was the country that actually instituted Nazism and trying to annihilate all Jews. And South Africa is the country that tried to do something keeping black people in a subjugated position. And so here we see those two nations are actually being drawn in as comparisons to Israel. And in reality, it's like calling David Goliath and Goliath David. Yes. And you know, we were always told when I was at Bible college about preaching, that in order to convince people, you didn't need to be logical, you didn't need to be truthful, you just needed to be repetitive. And they said if you say the same thing enough times, people believe it. And of course, that's the basis of good advertising. And so in the propaganda against Israel, we hear South Africa invoked all the time. This is an apartheid state, this is an apartheid state, this is an apartheid state. And we repeat that, oh, Israel is an apartheid state. And in reality, it's the opposite thing. And I told you a little bit about it last week, in the last show, I should say. But now I just want to tell you what happened in 1981. And I need a sip of water. But in 1981, the nationalist government, the NAC government in South Africa, began to try to formalize racism in a way that made it more acceptable to the outside world. And the reason that they did this is because South Africans are sport mad. Yes. Sport is really like a religion. And we had been cast out of the Olympic Games because of the way in which apartheid was entrenched in our country. And our sportsmen just hated the fact that no other country would play cricket with them or play rugby against them, or...
All of these things she's mentioning are South African sports, for those of you that are a little bit confused right now. Sort of the equivalent of the excitement of football season or baseball, or
yes,
whatever it is.
But also the athletics and the swimming, yes, and all those other things. And so the sportsmen began to put pressure upon the government. And there's nothing like pressure coming from people where, like, if your rugby or your football is your religion, and you beginning to really push for that to be opened up, somebody does something. And so what the government tried to do was to present apartheid in a way in which it seemed to be making moves towards genuine democracy. But in reality, they fooled everybody. Because they identified something that they called a tricameral government. But in 1981, that was when they were investigating it, how they could set it up. And on the committee that looked at this, they had white people, and I need to give you the terminology, the South African terminology. You were white if you were Caucasian. You were black if you were of African ethnicity. You were coloured if you were part of one race and part of another race, usually black-white, and then you were Indian if you were Asian. So on this committee, trying to formulate the tricameral government, they didn't include one black person, one person of African ethnicity. However, they did include some Chinese. So they had white people, coloured people, Indian people, and Chinese people. And they set this up, and in 1983, they formulated the tricameral government. And that meant that there was going to be a House of Assembly which would comprise 178 white people. Then there would be, I just need to get this correct. Okay, the coloured assembly were called the House of Representatives, and they were going to have 85 members, and then the House of Delegates, these were just names they took from somewhere. The House of Delegates would have 45 Indian people. However, the black people, those of African ethnicity, had their citizenship stripped from them. They were not even classified as citizens. And so this was the tricameral government, and they had a referendum. And I remember, and it was the year your dad and I got married. And I remember voting no. And people would say to me, but Fiona, what's wrong with you? This is a step forward. And I said, can you not understand? This is a step backwards. Because this is actually taking, for example, Indian people who came to this country 1 century ago as indentured laborers to work in the sugar fields and giving them a say in the government, whereas our ethnic indigenous people are being excluded. Now that was, and it was voted in. And so they did that, but it actually excluded the black people more and more. And so if you look at that, and you look at what happened in Israel, where the Jews, at least in Germany, where the Jews had their citizenship stripped from them, there's this exact parallel.
There is, and I mean, even thinking of that, you know, one of the things that we would kind of tell the kids that when I was doing these Holocaust Memorial Museum tours with them is, you know, German Jews who fought in World War I for Germany and won medals for bravery and valor had their citizenship stripped from them because they were Jews.
Yes.
And so we see the same, it's this pattern that repeats. It's repetitive, it keeps happening, and really at the end of the day what it is it's a deep-seated hatred. Yes. That is found in the hearts of different humans. And I don't know how many times I've said it, I'm so sorry, speaking of being repetitive. But if you've watched the show for any length of time, you'll know that I've said it a number of times. But the original plan for the final solution, which was birthed with Hitler and his 12 members in a house in Berlin.
In 14 minutes.
Yes. That plan was actually originated with Haman in the book of Esther. He spoke to the king and said, there is a people here, and spoke about them with such hatred and such venom, all because one Jew named Mordecai refused to bow down to Haman and pay him homage. He came up with this plan to annihilate Jews across the entire province, all 127 provinces that were under the king's ruling, and he came and his heart was to see all Jews annihilated, and really it's the same spirit in a different human vessel. And that spirit is one that is really birthed in the heart of the devil. That's where it comes from. This hatred of Jewish people. We see it thousands of years ago, repeated with Hitler, and now when you look at the crazy imams that are, in Iran and in various Muslim nations right now, what they speak about is that the reason they're working so feverishly to acquire the bomb is because they want to be able to accomplish in a number of minutes what took Hitler years to accomplish. And it's the same hatred that we're seeing. And that hatred is the basis for these lies that are propagated against Israel. And you were speaking about it, the repetitive nature of it. Most Black South Africans that I have spoken to about Israel will immediately speak about how it's just like South Africa was and how it's an apartheid state. And I go, man, you have no idea. Some of my friends in South Africa are like really famous musicians and really well known. And I've sat down and said, listen, I just need to tell you here, you're wrong. And I kind of sit and explain. And by the end of it, I've had a couple of them saying, will you take me on a tour to Israel? I'm like, yes, I will. I'd love to. But really, it comes down to misinformation and repetitive misinformation. Again, Nazi Germany, Der Stürmer, the newspaper that would come out at the bottom of every single page from when Hitler came in 1933, at the bottom of every page was printed, the Jews are our misfortune. Now, of course, the timing for all of that was perfect. They'd just come out of the Great Depression of 1929, and everybody wanted to blame all their misfortunes on someone, and so Hitler said it's the Jews. Now, of course, that wasn't just Hitler, his heart was filled with hatred that was an ancient demonic spirit. But the point is that repetitive lie took hold of the hearts of people, and that is how come we ended up with so many millions of Jews killed in the Holocaust, and which is also what makes the rebirth of the nation of Israel in 1948 a total miracle and very clear fulfillment of Isaiah 66:8. Can a nation be born in a day? The answer is yes. It happened on May the 14th, 1948. But we've done some shows on that before, and we'll keep talking about that. But what I want to talk about for a minute, and we may go a little over today, for which, I'm just giving you a little bit of warning. We'll go a couple minutes longer than we normally would. The wall that Israel has built is there because of terrorist attacks that were propagated against her people. At no point in time does Israel say that the Arabs are not citizens. You can go for it.
All the things that black people in South Africa suffered under apartheid do not apply to the Arab citizens of Israel.
No.
They are citizens. They have access to all the professions which the South African black people did not have. They've got Arab parties. There was no such thing as that in South Africa.
Yes.
Just the discrimination that people think the Palestinians are suffering is something that it's a completely different set of circumstances. But if we look within Israel, it is absolutely not an apartheid state, because whatever the Israeli Jews are able to do, the Israeli Arabs are able to do.
Yes, and there are checkpoints, but everybody has to cross through them. When I was driving through certain areas, I had to cross through them. If Jews are trying to cross into Ramallah or any Palestinian-controlled territory, they have to go through checkpoints. It's not that there's a line for Palestinians and a line for Israelis, then another line for somebody else. You all have to come through checkpoints, and there's a reason for this. I just want to read something to you. When this major outburst of violence started in September of 2000 from the Palestinians against the Israelis, during those 34 months from the beginning of the violence in September 2000 until the construction of the first continuous segment of the security fence at the end of July 2003, in those 34 months, Samaria-based terrorists carried out 73 attacks in which 293 Israelis were killed and 1,950 wounded. In the 11 months between the erection of the first segment at the beginning of August 2003 and at the end of June 2004, only 3 attacks were successful, and all 3 occurred in the first half of 2003. So from the time that the construction of this Israeli security fence started, the number of attacks declined by more than 90%. The number of Israelis murdered and wounded decreased by more than 70% and then 85% respectively following the building of this fence. And even the Palestinian terrorists have admitted that the fence is indeed a deterrent. On November 11th, 2006, Islamic Jihadi leader Abdullah Ramadan Shallah said on Al-Manat TV the terrorist organizations had every intention of continuing suicide bombing attacks, but that their timing and the possibility of implementing them from the West Bank depended on other factors. And he went on to speak about how the security fence was a major deterrent and an obstacle for them in carrying out their mission. So he was complaining about it, meaning we're going to keep doing this, but we can't right now because of this fence. So the value of the fence in saving lives is very evident. In 2002, the year before construction started, 457 Israelis were murdered, and in 2009, 8 Israelis were killed. So you can see the difference here. When you look at 2002, 457 Israelis were murdered by terrorist attacks carried out where there was no fence. But then in 2009, after the fence had been there for a while, only, and I say only, any Israeli dying is a tragedy. But if you look at 457 versus 8, you can see the gigantic chasm between those two numbers. And that is there's clear, that's clearly attributed to the fact that there was indeed a fence. Now, the other thing that happens that people do and that you'll see on TV is they'll show you the section of concrete wall that happens. And that concrete section of wall is actually only 3% of the entire fence line. It's there for a number of reasons, but the other 97% of it is really a high-tech, it's more like a wire-based fence, and it's really there as a deterrent to Palestinian people climbing over and throwing rocks at cars or whatever the case is. Now, terrorist attacks have continued, but the amount of them has decreased unbelievably because of this wall. So I just want to reiterate, and I actually think we're probably going to need to do a third part to this just so that I can get through the material that I've got here. But so let me say this, in next week's segment, which we're just literally going to sit here and keep going, but we're out of time again, I want to talk to you about the precedents and about other nations that have constructed fences. And I want to talk to you about Gaza and the tunnels that were built in Gaza. I want to speak to you about the way that Israel has done this, really all for the sake of preserving lives. Because remember too, every time a terrorist attack is carried out, Palestinians die too, not just Israelis. And so part of the reason that this was implemented was to save Palestinian children from being sent out to carry out these attacks, as well as to protect Israeli citizens. So I'm going to come to an end here because we are over time. But next week, we are going to look and wrap this up about how Israel is not an apartheid state. We're going to wrap this up and we're going to look at what Israel has done. I also want to just speak a little bit about what Israel has done for the whole world and how that really is just so evidenced in the technology advances and the medical advances and all these different things. I just want to touch on that for a moment and speak about how the seed of Abraham really has been a blessing to the whole world. But we are out of time. So thank you for joining us. I hope that this has given you some good information. And I hope that it's helping you to understand that Israel and South Africa under apartheid could not be further apart, and that there is literally nothing that is of similarity between the two. But we're going to finish this up next week. So make sure you tune in on Friday, israelupdate.org. Make sure you stay up to date with everything we're doing on Facebook. You can find us on the Israel Update channel on Facebook. And again, we have a new show for you every Friday. Thank you for taking the time out of your week to watch this. Thank you for your love of and support of Israel. We appreciate every single one of you taking the time to watch this. So Shabbat Shalom and God bless.